It says that it's channel 8. I don't know what else to do. It's hard for me. Can you hear me now? Okay. This is where it's going to sit, so hopefully that's good.
Sounds pretty good. Have a conversation.
Okay. Yeah, so I was talking about, we went to Walter's afterwards and had some more cheese curds, and then,
Some more cheese curds, like you had already been there previously.
yes, that's where we went before and had cheese curds.
Where's Walter's?
Tosa, 69th and North, 70th and North. It's pretty delicious. Sound good?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Are you just,
We went to Rock Bottom Brewery.
did you?
For it was a high school reunion that night, so we saw a bunch of people there, and then we went to Moe's after that.
Oh yeah, you were talking about that.
I didn't get home till like 3 or 4 a.m. So.
That's awful. Yep.
Slept pretty much all day Sunday.
I didn't feel awful on Sunday.
I still feel like.
Really? Yep. All right. I don't know how this is going to go, you guys. Oh, people like it. Or even if they don't, whatever is cool with me.
What?
Saying how shitty this topic is. Just kidding. I'm just teasing. I feel like I have the hardest. I really like to do this stuff. I'm pretty bad at it. I get nervous. Just kidding. I'm just teasing. But I always feel like I can't pick a topic. Because the things that I have expertise in are things that nobody really cares about, for the most part. Yeah. What's that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
volume on the mic,
Turn up the volume.
and then I turned this down, so that's why you could.
Yeah. That's why what?
That's why there's that background.
The hiss.
Should be good to go.
Sweet. Hey, you came.
Yeah, I'm here. Let's go.
Yeah. Thank Dave for that.
Right.
Giving me a microphone.
Yep. I'm gonna grab lunch. And I'll be back.
Cool. Thank you.
For the start.
Thanks for your help.
So it is live streaming on that full thing. Check.
So don't say anything stupid. Hi, Chris.
I think so. I'm pretty sure we have all of the security measures taped over and disabled.
Like we should.
Yeah.
Including the word security.
Yeah. That's kind of like my one big complaint about the office is that we spend all the time putting in all these locks and everything.
Mhm.
We don't use any of them, but we don't have working locks on the outside doors, so you just can't use those stairs.
Yep.
What's that? I thought those were supposed to be active. The ones on the outside? Yeah. Oh, I haven't tried it in a while.
Yeah, apparently there are only so many nodes that the building can handle. So we activated, I told you, we activated the ones on the outside stairs, and we activated some of the internal ones, which is why they have to hold them. Figure that you guys size,
It's kind of like putting like user auth on a website and then just leaving all your passwords as admin password, which we talked about earlier today. It's like the illusion of security. Or like we do at home, we have, before we bought our house, they had a security system installed, and there was a sign out front. We have not like called to have it set up, but we still left the sign out front.
They just buy the sign and put it in.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yep. Do that?
It's got like one of the signs missing.
Well, that's what I'm worried about. So that's what I'm worried about. Is at some point, like somebody, a smart thief, is going to look at it and be like, "That company's been out of business for 10 years. You know, like that's not helping you at all." I don't know.
Maybe like that's their field and they know that.
Hmm.
He's probably going to be there. Probably.
So here's the thing though, does like anyone else on your block also have home security? They'll
Yes.
probably look at your place and be like, oh, it has some sort of security.
Yeah.
Go to a place without any security.
That's true. Rachel, we didn't talk to you at all at the party.
No, I didn't get to talk to a lot of people.
What was going on?
It's just really short. Just like 4 nights.
Yeah, it was. It did feel short.
I was so full though.
Because that dessert was like massive. It's huge.
I'm not a cake fan, but I devoured it.
It was good. It was definitely good.
Yeah, it was like
Mm-hmm. Caramely.
I think what made the cake so heavy was that instead of using frosting, they used mousse.
That's awesome because I hate
yeah.
frosting. That's why I don't like cake is because frosting. Unless it's homemade. Yeah, I will just like eat the cake out and eat the frosting. Especially that like nasty sugar, like you taste everything on sugar.
Yeah. I feel like frosting really needs to be asked.
I think they're just like everyone can do frosting instead of like actually making.
Oh yeah, maybe.
Dude, I like cream cheese frosting, yeah. So my grandma makes like banana pancakes and then cream cheese frosting and they're like to die for, but any other time.
It's not WordPress. I totally mistitled it. Totally mistitled it.
Steve, are we your practice audience?
You are a little bit my practice audience. I'm doing it again on Wednesday with the Milwaukee Web Pros. Yeah.
Ambitious.
Yeah. I mean, might as well get it over right away, right?
That's a good way to look at it, I guess.
So not that I don't think that this is a great audience for this, but I think that the one I'm doing on Wednesday, the audience is better because a lot of those people are WordPress users who live and die by it. And we use it, but most of us don't use it. Yeah.
People that go to that meetup generally are.
Yeah.
Like more introductory or I think you're right.
Yeah. So if I totally screw up here, whatever. Yeah. I think you have already. Yep.
We'll let you know for sure.
Yeah, I know there were scenarios where there was an out. I mean, an out, but it was like back. And from what they said is, oh, there's some skid loaders on site. So they can kick them off, start working, enter next year, and come back. So we park the skid loader. We don't know that. There is an but that's information for you.
So, the holiday party itself was kind of short. Don't know next trip will be kind of but there's stuff that happened after that. All right.
Give it another minute. It's just after 12. All right, you guys ready? 12:02.
Kick it off, Steve.
All right, let's giddy up. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm actually not going to be talking too much about WordPress. It's something else, but I might have mistitled the talk. So, you guys know me. I'm a developer here. I have a crap ton of experience, over 15 years. One thing about me is that I am terrified to have a digital presence, an online presence. I don't like putting myself out there. So I kind of was going through, some evaluation of goals and things like that, and started thinking, well, maybe it's a good time for me to start blogging. I always talk about doing it. I never actually do it. So I have been looking. Honestly, I've worked with so many CMSs over the years, trying to figure out what would make a great platform to do blogging in. And so, this is the conversation I had with myself. I should start blogging. And before I really started digging into what cool kids were using to do it, my knee-jerk reaction to it is, well, I'll use WordPress. It's super easy. I've used it before. It's what people do. So as I started digging into it a little bit, I think this is a pretty likely scenario that people see when they are working with WordPress. You put your site out, you put up a new blog post. It's like, yeah, this is awesome, and I'm totally going to do this all the time. A couple weeks go by, there's a new JavaScript framework, so you post about it. It's pretty cool. You're using it, it's awesome. You get, not even barely a month into the life of your site, and there's an announcement that WordPress has been hacked. So it takes you a few days, but you go update it as quickly as you can, because you don't want to be hacked. Another month goes by, you put out a blog post again. There's another new JavaScript framework. Not a couple weeks after that, you're hacked again, and you have to go click the button. At this point, you're looking at a 2 or 3 week delay to update things, just because you're hardly ever using the site. But you got to do it. And then finally, this is your 4th blog post of the year in June. That sounds about right. And your 3rd hack from WordPress. And WordPress is hacked so often that this just happens all the time. At this point, it's apathy. You've gotten to the point where you don't even want to bother to update your site anymore, because all you're doing is clicking the button to update. You're not even actually writing any content. So how do we get to this point? The dynamic CMS has it's fooled us. We hear that it's so easy to set up. Anyone can use it. And if you were going to do it statically, it'd just be a maintenance nightmare. You'd be copying and pasting things all over the place. So it's just the knee-jerk reaction. That's how you do it. If you want to build something that has content on it, you've got to do it with WordPress or Joomla or Drupal or any of those CMSs that serve your content dynamically. But I think there's some important questions to ask about that. Number one, is your data really dynamic? Is every user that comes to your site, are they seeing the same thing? If they are, it's not really dynamic. If your data is changing, for once every month when you're putting out a blog post, it's not really dynamic. Another question to ask is if you have the time to support a dynamic site. WordPress, the numbers that are most accessible on the internet right now are that it runs 25% of websites on the internet. I will preface these numbers by saying that some of them are a year or so old. But I don't think that things have gotten better in this time. And in fact, the 25% of the website, or of the internet that runs on WordPress is increasing. 70% of WordPress installs are vulnerable, just because people let them get out of date and don't update them. And 20% of the top 50 WordPress plugins are also vulnerable, usually to things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, those types of vulnerabilities. And a lot of times when you set up a WordPress site, you're installing plugins from all over the place, and you have no idea whether those authors are actually taking care to make sure that they may not even know that they're vulnerable. And you're really depending on them to handle the security for you. And the other, one of the things that I always thought about building a site statically was the copy paste. You've got to make this layout look the same all over the place, and there's so much work to it. It's actually really, really easy, and that's what I wanted to talk about. So to clarify what I mean when I say static versus dynamic, a dynamic website, your content's generated dynamically upon each request. So these are the big CMSs that we all know about: WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, Umbraco in the .NET space. Sitecore, there's a ton of them. It could also be custom-built websites. Maybe you built your own CMS or your own content-driven website. But the basic idea is there's server-side logic that takes content from a database and serves it out to the user. Static websites, on the other hand, I'll kind of refer to them as static gen a lot, and you'll see why in a little bit. But it doesn't mean that your content never changes. It just means that your content is stored statically instead of storing it dynamically. So when the user requests it from your server, you're not hitting the CMS and generating content from the database. You're actually literally requesting an HTML file, and that's what you're getting. So the dynamic aspect of a static website, or a static generated website, it's processed when you're writing the content instead of when the content is being served. So to illustrate, if somebody wants to hit my dynamic site, everything within this gray box is in the span of the request. So the traffic over the internet hits my web server, my CMS, reaches out to a database, converts through some process my data into HTML. You can do things with caching to alleviate this. And in that case, you're just making it more complex. There's more things happening inside of that gray box that is the request. The other thing is the data in the database gets there through an admin tool. The admin tool is outside of the request. Everything else in the gray box is within the lifetime of that request. Contrasted with a static website, the request goes into my web server, and literally all it's getting is HTML documents. So there's a whole lot less happening in the span of that request, which really helps boost the speed. And again, there's some sort of offline process here, a static generation that converts whatever your content is to markup. So the gears there, where the magic happens, are outside of the requests. In the dynamic site, they're inside of the request. So obviously, there should be a little bit of a performance difference between those two. Just a real quick summary of how you do certain things within a static site generator. How do you install it? Every one is completely different, and there are a ton of them. I'll show you that in a little bit. But pretty much all of them have good tutorials for getting set up, getting started. For customizing things, some static generators support themes. Some of them don't. Some of them have plugins that allow you to use themes. And then the really simpler ones, like the one that I'll go through with you later, is you're writing your less or your Sass just right in your directory, and then it gets precompiled or gets compiled into your output. In terms of writing content, you can use your favorite text editor. There aren't a whole lot of static generators that have a UI to go with it for an admin UI. There are some that have it. We'll talk about those a little bit later. And then you're going to use your whatever templating or markup language you want to write this stuff. And so we'll talk a little bit about templating. For the most part, when you're using a templating language, this is just some sort of markup language that can be interpreted and have things injected into it, like a title or some sort of processing directive to go through and display your content. And for the most part, when you're looking at these, there's a ton of them, but they all kind of deal with what is the format with which I'm going to specify that something dynamic goes here. So EJS is one that's pretty big with in the Node community. In this case, you're using less than % to indicate that here's where some dynamic content is going to go. Compared to handlebars, very similar, except you're using mustaches instead of brackets. Some of them are a little more abstract. Jade is one that I have been looking into that I like quite a bit, but it eliminates a lot of the boilerplate stuff that you're typing, but it's very, it's white space sensitive. So you're indenting, anything that you're indenting is a child of the element above it. But it helps you eliminate a lot of that, the same code that you keep typing over and over. So this one's a little bit different. But again, it's how do I specify to the engine that this is going to be data in here instead of something that I know up front. In terms of markup, almost always you're going to be using Markdown. There are other markup languages out there like Textile that are supported a little bit, but for the most part, pretty much everyone supports markup, or Markdown, rather. So in this case, it's most of us know Markdown in this room, but really you're looking at just simple ways to specify what it's going to turn into. On the left, using symbols to indicate that it's a header or a list of items. So the content editor, whether that's you or someone else, this is going to be what they're going to be working in for the most part. So what I want to do then is run through a quick demo of how quick it is to set this up. The static generator that I want to talk about right now is called Harp server. The reason I'm going to use this one is because it is super simple. It comes with a lot of, like it says, it has built-in pre-processing. Pretty much you basically set up the site and then you're ready to just go in and start creating content. Because it's so simple, there are features that exist in other static generators that it doesn't have. But to get from 0 to a website, I don't know that this can be beat. So as we can see, they tell you up here, you install, first you're going to need Node, so you can use NPM. Then you install Harp globally, and then it's literally these 2 lines will get you a website. I'm not going to install Harp globally because I've already done that, and it takes a while. But really, so if I'm here, oops, that's not right. There we go. So here I'm in a folder. I've got Harp installed, and I'm just going to say Harp init and give it a folder. It's going to do some stuff. And what it will have generated, we'll take a look in VS Code. Can you guys see things OK? Is the text font size good? Cool. So all I get when I init a Harp site is 4 files inside of the directory that I chose. I get a layout file, which is written in Jade and is really simple. HTML with a head linking to your style sheet and a body that yields the flow to the content itself. I get a style sheet. Again, very simple, out of the box. 3 different styles in here for the most part. And then I get an index page, which is also in Jade. Harp out of the box supports Jade, EJS, and then it also supports Markdown. But when you actually init the server, they give you your content in the format of Jade versus Markdown, which I actually like because I think it's a great language. And then you get a 404 page, and that's literally it. So once I've done that, a lot of static generators have the concept of a server, essentially spinning up a Node Express server instance. So I can say Harp server source, and I can specify a port. And it'll tell me that it's listening at localhost 1234, so that when I go to localhost 1234, I have a website. Now, this isn't what you would push live. This is still, when you're working with the local server, it's technically, that's how you'd be just building things out and making sure that what you're doing isn't ugly. So to actually build some things out, we can go in here and I can say, OK, well, this is cool. I know I'm going to also want an about page, so let's make an about page. We'll use Jade, just because I like it. And we'll say that this one is all about me. And then I can say some things like, static stuff, and a no thanks. So as soon as I save that file, I can go back to my website. Nothing's changed there, but I can now go to About HTML, and there's my content served up. So you can see how you'd want to obviously like spend a lot of time building out a layout, making it look really nice. But the process of actually getting content out there is so simple. It's basically 2 commands, and then you just write content. However, if I wanted to actually deploy this somewhere, host it on a server somewhere, I would want to compile it. Right now, because it's running the HARP or the Express instance, I don't actually have static documents there. And you can see that in my, all I have is a source directory. I don't actually have any static HTML documents there yet. And so this is where the only other HARP command that you need is, which is to compile your source folder into your output directory. And it's done. And you can see it built me out a www directory with a whole bunch of static HTML documents minified. And then my CSS file, also minified. Yeah, so getting from 0 to running is super duper quick with HARP. And I think this was the first static generator that I kind of stumbled across. Some of the things that become a little more difficult with HARP are when you start wanting to serve up lists of content and things like that. But there are ways to do it. Inside of your Jade template, here I'm doing a yield. You also have access to a whole lot of metadata about every file. And if you want to add more metadata, you can add basically a data JSON file. And here's where I'm going to switch over for a minute and take the pre-baked turkey out of the oven. So you can see if I look at my source now, I've got I've built out my content with my blog, got all my posts in it. Any content that I wanted to put in it just gets copied over to the output directory. So any images that are in there, my CSS, I can even pull in Bootstrap if I want to. Using the Bootstrap less files, I've pulled that in. One thing that I want to point out is you'll see that I'm naming things a lot in here with underscores. And there's a specific reason for that. Static generators, as a rule, will ignore or will skip outputting any file or folder that's named with an underscore. So if I have, for instance, a layout file, I don't want an actual layout.html in the output directory. By naming it with an underscore, HARP knows, well, this is just something that's used, but I don't actually need to turn it into a file. So yeah, we probably will come back here in a little bit. Any questions before I move on a little bit? Yes, it is within HARP. It is a convention. There are plenty where you can specify the layout. I don't actually know if HARP allows you to override that convention and specify something, but I think that it does. Oh, one other thing I wanted to on that subject, with HARP, there's a lot of data.json files that you use to manage your metadata. So that's also by convention. Like here in this folder, I have a data.json file that says that I have an index page and an about page, so you can see there's an about page and an index page. And then here's where you would attach any of your custom metadata, is within this file. I don't know that there's a way to do it with HARP. There's a concept of something called front matter within static generation. And I'm going to show you a difference between those two things in a little bit. But that allows you to include the metadata inside of the file that you're editing. That was one of the big reasons as I was rolling through with HARP that I kind of decided it wasn't exactly what I wanted, was because all of my metadata had to be in a separate file than my actual content. But the majority of static generators do support front matter. Cool. All right, so why would you use static site generation? 4 reasons, and they all begin with S, which is just coincidence. Number 1, speed and performance. Right, we talked about that drawing where the gears and the magic are happening inside of the gray request box or outside of the gray request box. Static HTML files just serve a lot faster. They're also CDN ready. It's just a static file. You can hook that up with a CDN, and that will definitely help your performance. You also don't have to deal with load balancing headaches of having your, if you've got any sort of memory caching or anything like that on multiple instances of a load balancer. Security, dynamic CMSs are hackable. We talked about WordPress a little bit. There's a new hack like every month. There's so little to be hacked with static site generators because it's just static content. So the only thing you really have to worry about is, are they going to hack my web server? Simplicity, fewer moving parts. Right, again, like the gears, you want them inside of the box or outside of the box, but then also you don't have to worry about caching. You don't have to worry about like your data storage or any of that stuff. It's your content is just sitting there in the file system, which is actually brings me to my next point, which is that because it's sitting in your file system, all of your content is now in source control, which is cool. Because a lot of times, when you're working with a dynamic CMS, there's such trouble in terms of synchronizing your QA environment with your production environment and getting all of that live content down. A lot of CMSs have tools to do that for you, but then some don't. And then you're dealing with backup and restore on your database a lot. When would I use it? So if you're building a simple site, like a blog is a great example of why you would do it. A brochure site where it's really just like a handful of pages, and you just want to advertise, your brand. That would be a great example. The next 2 are the ones that I think are the most intriguing for us. Documentation would be great, a great use case for static site generation. And then also, if we were in a project where we wanted to maintain a living style guide, that'd be another situation where you can go in and just keep all of your styles in the file system and have that easily available. But I guess the main idea is that if you have a high read to write ratio, so if you're writing content once and then a lot of people are reading it, like a blog, that's a great example of when you would use static site generation. If you're writing a news feed where you're just firing off updates left and right, and you don't have as many reads for every one of those times that you push the data out, you're going to be dealing with a full refresh of the site basically every time you make changes to your content. So if you've got like BuzzFeed where you're putting out a new list article every 5 minutes, that's probably not a good situation to use it. So another point is that a lot of websites have needs for dynamic content in the form of things like allowing comments or having some sort of search functionality. And if any of the things that you need to do can be met by a third party, like Disqus for comments or Google Custom Search for searching, or just dropping like a Twitter or Facebook widget on it if you wanted to do something like that. All of those services are out there for you to use, and it allows you to assemble what looks more like a dynamic site. Unfortunately, if you're doing something where those services don't exist, it sometimes takes a little bit more work to make that happen. So all of us in this room are totally capable of building, a whole bunch of custom JavaScript that can do things that interact with services to make it seem like it's a dynamic site. So for instance, site search. If you wanted a custom site search, you could use a framework named Lunar.js, which allows you to do good searching of content and then just have a static endpoint that dumps out all of your content in a JSON file. And you'd be able to build a site search that way. It's something that, if it's someone who has used WordPress and that's about it, might be a little too much for them to tackle. But with a little bit of courage, it's definitely something that you can make happen. And then user profiles. I think you guys were doing this with Firebase with the device manager app. Like all your user profiles are kind of managed in an external service instead of on the server. There's another service named User App IO that does similar stuff to that. So when would you use dynamic or rather than static? If your content authors lack technical skill, if you're building a site for, like if I was building a site for my mom, there's no way I'd be able to get her to do these things. And the main problem with that is that there's no really good out-of-the-box UI for static site generation. I think in a year it will be different, and I think that there will be services out there that will help out with that and really make it possible to use static site generation with the real people outside of our walls, the people who don't have the skills that we have. So there are some that exist. Hexo is a static site generator that has a UI built in, but it's kind of crappy, not super impressive. But for the most part, these things are services that you'd use to generate your content with an admin UI. And in all cases, like none of them are quite right yet. Whether they're too expensive, they're too difficult to hook up, or they're just not that great. And again, because you're writing content with Markdown or Jade or whatever you want for templating, if you've got somebody who's going to be afraid to do that stuff, it's going to be a little more difficult for them. If your content changes a lot, right? We talked about the BuzzFeed example where they're pushing out content all the time. In that case, every change to your content basically rebuilds the site. And so if you're putting out a ton, you're going to be rebuilding the site every single time. A lot of the static site generators are better at doing the incremental builds and only pushing out the things that did change, but it still might be a problem. If your content is really dynamic, like it's user-based content, they're uploading things all over the place and customizing things however they want, or if you've got complex filtering, searching on the site, or you have a massive product catalog that would be difficult to maintain in the file system, those are all reasons that you wouldn't want to use static site generation. And then also, if you're scared of the command line, which I, until 2 years ago, was terrified of the command line. I'm a GUI developer. But at this point, nobody here is. But if you are, you shouldn't be, because there's a whole world of possibilities. So making a choice between static site generators. The first thing I'm going to show you is staticgen.com, which is awesome, but it shows you how many options there are, right? Like so this website basically just manages or it keeps a list of all the static site generators that it knows about, and it's literally hundreds at this point. So how do you pick from that list, right? It's impossible. They're ranked in order of popularity. And it's a pretty good rule of thumb that if it's near the top, there's a reason for it. So Jekyll is number one on this list. And Jekyll gets a lot of support from GitHub, or GitHub gives Jekyll a lot of support. All of the GitHub Pages stuff is run on Jekyll, or runs Jekyll. So there's no wonder that that one is number one. But basically, what you're going to have to do with this is look at the list, determine your criteria, and then figure out which one works for you. I've tried probably 6 of them out since I kind of started digging into this. And I have a favorite at this point, but they're all so different. And it's a matter of figuring out what it is that you're looking for and finding a match. So some of the criteria that I used to look into this, the engine language, JavaScript, versus Ruby versus Go. There's even one in PHP. If there's one language that you prefer, you can filter that list by language and do it that way. I avoided Ruby because I don't know Ruby. And I was looking mostly at JavaScript, and I did look at one Go static generator named Hugo, which was actually pretty nice. Templating language, you can choose whichever one you want. Maybe you don't know. I didn't know which one I liked. I learned that I liked Jade. But there's any combination of all these things. Simplicity versus customization. So the example that I showed was using Harp. And the reason that I showed it is because it is so simple. Unfortunately, because it is so simple, it doesn't allow you to do certain things, and it's not super extensible. There are definitely some out there that are extremely extensible. And in fact, the one that I ended up settling on as my favorite so far is named Metalsmith. And it is, it's basically a glorified task runner, or a specialized task runner. So with Metalsmith, a lot of times, out of the box, it does literally nothing. You have to go opt in and tell it which plugins you want to assemble and the pipeline, the order in which you want to build them. And I can show you an example of that in a little bit. So that's like that's the other end of the extreme, the ultimate customization versus Harp, which is almost no customization. And then plugins. Do you need plugins? Because there are some that don't really support plugins. Harp doesn't support plugins. Metalsmith is nothing but plugins. And then front matter, we kind of talked about this a little bit. I didn't know that this was a criterion for me until I started digging into it. And that's when I was playing around with Harp, I kind of realized, well, this kind of sucks that I have to have metadata in a different file than within the same file. So the concept of front matter is that the name is taken from publishing. I don't really know what it means, but it's basically having your metadata in the same file as your actual content. So you can see here on the left, I've got this whole block in here. This just describes my content, and then my content is below it, versus an example from Harp where my metadata is in a totally separate file. And that's kind of seems like kind of a trivial, like, well, you don't need it to be in the same file, but stylistically, it made more sense to me to have it in the same file. Some of the options that I looked at, and this is honestly, like, if you're going to start using one, this is what you're looking at. You've got to have like some way of making a decision. So Harp, to give the elevator speech on Harp, it's super easy to use, gets you up and running almost instantly, but it's more difficult to extend. Hugo's big claim is that it's super fast. So if you have a lot of content that you want to generate a site from, it would be a great option for you. It's written in Go. It also looks really nice compared to the others. It uses themes, and there are a lot of really nice looking themes out there. So I think if I were recommending to someone who was a WordPress developer who just did sites that they wanted to look nice, that's probably the one that I would point them to, is Hugo. Jekyll, I think every developer's heard of it because it's so it's like ingrained in the GitHub culture, right? Like every GitHub page that's out there is probably built on Jekyll. And you can definitely build your GitHub pages without using Jekyll. You can do it just using any static site generator you want, and then just push out the content that got generated. But yeah, so Jekyll has great support. It's got a lot of good documentation, so that would be a good way to get started for someone who is looking for more the technical side of it. And then Metalsmith takes a little bit more to get into, but it's so extensible that it was definitely the one that once I started working with that one, that was exactly what I was looking for. In terms of hosting a static site, where would you host it? Literally anywhere, because it's static files. So you can use any existing hosting providers that you like. You can find the cheapest host that you want because it's just static files. There are a couple of hosts that specialize in static site hosting. One of them is named Netlify, and if their free tier is really great, and it has a lot of support for actually doing the compilation when you push to their site, or as soon as you push your repo, it'll do the compilation for you and dump it out to their site. The biggest issue with it is that if you can't use the free tier, for instance, if you want a custom domain name, it's like $10 a month, which is too much for a simple web host. They try to sell you on the fact that like it's got CDN support built in, and you can use SSL through Let's Encrypt. But if you're not using the free tier, I find that one to be not worth it. And then GitHub Pages is another place that you can host a static site. You get a GitHub page for your user account and then for any project site that you have. One workaround that's I've heard for the fact that you only get one per user is you can also then just go create an organization and you get a free site for that if you want. That's all I got. Any questions?
I think they'll bring static site generation to WordPress instead of generating static assets.
I don't know that they have any plans to do that. I think that it would be a huge step in the right direction, but I also think it goes pretty against like the nature of WordPress. Like they have such a community built around it being a PHP site, and all the plugins are written. I don't know how many there are out there, but people would have to rewrite all that stuff at some point.
People also like being able to just go to /wp-admin and edit the content right there.
I'm not saying I would still have the admin portal, just
Mhm.
all the front-facing content pages to generate static assets. So I mean, you could almost have the content portal on a different domain, and then just do all the static.
Right.
And that would at least give you
Yeah.
a backend. And
Yep. So there's a couple services that are kind of headed that direction. One of them is named Contentful, and Contentful is basically like a web CMS, but it doesn't take care of the backend for you. You have to basically integrate it with your backend, and I think that's where I'm excited. I think services like that are going to be pretty. I think the support is going to get better so that it's really easy to go say, you know what, I'm going to build my site on Contentful.com, and I'm going to click a few buttons and change a few settings so that when it gets deployed, it pushes it out to my repository or something like that. And then my host pulls it from my repository and deploys it for me. Another one is named Cloud Cannon, and that's more. They specifically gear themselves more towards Jekyll, but it's a great looking UI. Unfortunately, that one doesn't have, as far as I can tell, it doesn't have a free tier, and it looked like it was pretty expensive, $25 a month for basic use of that. I think if you were in a situation where you were doing this for somebody who had money to spend on a website, you would do it. If you're doing it for yourself, for your own personal website, I don't think that's going to be worth it. Cool. Sure. So I would say that there probably is going to be a case, depending on how into it you're getting. I think there's a good chance that you'll probably at least be looking at code to figure out what happens or figure out why it's not doing what you're expecting it to. Metalsmith, the one that I like, that's like the specialized task runner, in that one, you can write your own plugins to do whatever. So the fact that it's in JavaScript and I know JavaScript was super helpful for me to jump into that one. But aside from that, I mean, Hugo, especially the big one that uses Go, does so much out of the box that I think it'd be no problem. And that's kind of the feeling that I had when I started looking into Hugo was, I don't know Go. I'm kind of scared to learn it. I don't need to learn any more languages. But it's such an easy experience from the start that you can get a really nice looking site without ever looking at Go.
I did the exact same thing. You know,
Yeah.
Go is like one executable, with a partial generator, and templated off of something else inside of your data mesh to actually get it working the way I wanted it to.
Yep.
But I didn't have to execute Go at all. It's all like that.
Yep.
I was curious, what kind of issues do you start running into after the runners up like you know, like with templating or having it?
Sure.
Mobile,
So one of the issues, not an issue, but a challenge is trying to figure out how to serve up your, if you're putting out a blog, getting it to dynamically figure out what all the posts are so that you don't have to keep adding links to something or something like that. And in that case, it's all just in the templating language. And then knowing what metadata you have to work with to loop through all of your content. Aside from that, I can't think of anything offhand. Metalsmith, the challenge with Metalsmith was getting it set up, honestly. Once you've got it set up, it's great, but I'll pull up an example of that. And it's kind of a bad example because there's I'm doing a little bit more in here than I need to. Let's see. Let's find the index. Nope. Build.js somewhere. Where are you? There it is. So this is what your build script looks like in a Metalsmith project. It looks a lot like if you were doing a grunt file. So you're pulling in all the plugins. I'm doing a little bit of extra here stuff to allow it to run as a server versus just building the content. But you start with your Metalsmith root, and then you just append a whole bunch of stuff, like tell it pull from the content folder, use Jade for templating languages, use layouts using Jade, use Sass to compile the preprocessor. Some things that you can specify. Use permalinks. This is actually, I probably should have mentioned this, but when I was building the example with Harp, and I should have, sorry, I'm going to pull up VS Code. I should have shown this, but building the example with Harp out of the box, that about.jade got turned into about.html, which means that when I'm going to request it over the wire, it's got to be about.html. But pretty much every static generator has the concept of permalinks as a feature that you can opt into. And all it ends up doing is instead of creating an about.html, it creates an about folder with an index.html inside of it. So your URL just looks like /about. And so you don't have to append .html to everything. Hugo actually out of the box supports that, which I think is awesome. The rest of them, for some reason, you have to opt into it. But back to our Metalsmith example, if I can find it. So I opt into all these things, and then ignore the run as server stuff. That's just other noise. But I can serve it up. I can watch it. I can have it clean. And here's where I ended up writing some custom JavaScript as a plugin within Metalsmith. The reason being that the clean process, it's a totally like stupid detail, but basically I had to output the compiled files into the root in order for GitHub pages as a user GitHub page to see the content. It's got to be in the root. And Metalsmith, when you try to compile it into the root, it does it clean before it does it, and then it tries to blow away all of your source files, which is super sucky. And your Git folder, which once the Git folder is gone, you can't recover it. So don't do that. But yeah, here's an example where it was cool that I knew JavaScript, because I could just say, OK, now I'm going to go write something that executes a custom cleanup script, which leaves other things behind. But with Metalsmith, this is the hard part, and then once you've got it there, it's running smoothly.
So for that, what I was going to, Hugo talks about this, so it still takes a while to actually probably get to do that. But since they can have the public folder,
Uh-huh.
you can use the submodule to link your GitHub, your GitHub pages.
Yep.
And keep them separate. So it's nice to actually have one markdown, one spot, you have to generate content somewhere else, and you don't continuously blast yourself.
Yep. Exactly. One of the things that I thought was that when you're using a GitHub project page, it's different than if you use a GitHub user page. Instead of having it in the root, they want it in its own special branch, which I find it really strange that they do it two different ways for the two different types of pages. But so in that example, it seems like people always have a step built into their build pipeline that says, oh, also commit this in this other branch and push it. What else? No. I've searched it enough times that the price is built up to thousands of dollars. Then I'm lying. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you. You guys are the best audience I've ever had. I do.